fringe elements, and frankly, he's not really worth my time.
I don't know why I'm even responding to you. You're not even worth my time. The only reason I'm responding is because some other people sent me your video. You're beneath me.
Sophia, don't do that. It's asinine.
I actually laughed when you said this. It seems that you were arguing that dog breeds are more genetically diverse within breed than between. Now, I don't know what you were smoking when you made that deduction, but it's wrong.
An analysis of molecular variance in the microsatellite data showed that variation among breeds accounts for more than 27% of total genetic variation. This is from Genetic Structure of the Purebred Domestic Dog by Heidi Parker. The contribution of these groupings to genetic variation was assessed by an analysis of molecular variance, AMOVA, Supplementary Table 5, which showed that 65% of the variation is due to variation within dog breeds and 31% is due to variation within breed groups, similar to that reported for microsatellite data. This is from Genome-Wide SNP and Haplotype Analyses Reveal a Rich History Underlying Dog Domestication. This is a Nature paper. So apparently I was smoking the same thing these people were smoking. I know you're trying to make it look like this is a debate between you and me, but it's not. It's between you and all the scientists who have actually researched this. I'm just relaying what they're saying. Sophia Rune then goes on to talk about some diseases that dog breeds get from inbreeding and then says,
And you tell me that, having high genetic diversity and admixture is a bad thing.
Why would I say that? Just from the IQ studies, I know that people who inbreed have lower IQs on average. I've never been an advocate of family inbreeding. But since you asked for a downside of too much genetic diversity, well, here's something Michael Lynch said regarding outbreeding depression. Quote, a second way outbreeding depression can occur is by the breakdown of biochemical or physiological compatibilities between genes in the different populations. Within local isolated populations, alleles are selected for their positive overall effect on the local genetic background. Due to non-additive gene action, the same genes may have rather different average effects in different genetic backgrounds. Hence, the potential evolution of locally co-adapted gene complexes, which, as I can infer from this, get broken down when you breed with an organism that is genetically distant. Is this true? I'm not sure. Sounds plausible, but I'm not arguing about this. I'm arguing about race differences. Sophia Rune then says some stuff that everyone knows about race differences being based on allele frequencies and not on gene type differences, and then says,
Fringe Elements seems to be proposing some kind of model that if you change an environment, that everything changes. That evolution starts operating on everything, and that there are selective advantages for every single trait based on an environmental change.
No. There are lots of things that the races have that are very similar. Gross brain morphology is not one of them. And Wu and Zhang have argued that genes associated with neuron development show more population differentiation than genes associated with pigmentation between the East Asians, Nigerians, and Dutch samples in the HapMap project.
As if somehow there aren't things that are adaptive in all environments across the board.
It's possible that every environment on the planet had precisely identical cognitive demands. It'd be quite a coincidence.
And differences between them. Incidentally, short tandem repeats are selectively neutral. And because they're selectively neutral, they are more likely to be more variable between different groups, because there is neither a disadvantage nor advantage to having them.
Wow, this is interesting. So a piece of genetic data that faces the least selective pressures, since they are non-coding, show the greatest racial disparities, whereas genes that face selective pressures show less racial differentiation due to a certain similarity of environments around planet Earth. This is why everyone has the same skin color. Oh wait, no, they don't. There are tons of things that races differ on that were a result of selection. All short tandem repeats show is that the selective pressures on planet Earth are more consistent than complete randomness. It doesn't mean that the selective pressures for cognitive function are identical from region to region. You're grasping at straws here.
Like, to give you an idea, let's say you take a kidney from an African person and a kidney from a Caucasian person and you put them on the table. Are you going to be able to tell the difference, Fringe?
No, and I also wouldn't be able to tell the difference between the kidneys of a house cat and a rabbit.
All you're doing is parroting Rushton's retarded model.
No.
Here's a table from a paper by Kenneth Beals, Cortland Smith, and Stephen Dodd. What they found is that the cranial capacity of populations in temperate or cold climates on any continent are higher than those in warm climates on the same continent. However they were defining continent, you can read the paper to see all the specifics about that. I know you like to say that it's just Rushton saying this, but it's not. I'm not sure if I believe this or not. You know, this thing about the cold resulting in larger cranial capacities seems plausible to me, but I haven't really looked into it. I wasn't specific about the causes of larger cranial capacities, nor do I need to be. All I said was that environments were different, and they clearly affected the brains because the brains are different. Different races have, on average, different gross morphology in their brains. I don't have to provide any specific theory about how it happened. That's just a standard that you're pulling out of your ass.
So it falls flat on its face there, but there's another problem. Rushton's model should predict, if it's correct, extraordinarily high intelligence in the Native American populations. And unfortunately, right now, the Native American population's intelligence or IQ testing isn't that high. IQ and intelligence, as far as I'm concerned, are not synonyms, but okay. Their IQs are not that high. In fact, in some cases, the standard deviation is a full standard deviation below the average white IQ.
Okay, well, there's clearly a correlation between brain size and IQ. Certain Native Americans from more northerly regions and Arctic peoples have larger cranial capacities, but don't have exceptionally high IQs. In Race Differences in Intelligence, Richard Lynn writes, quote, "The Inuit have an unusually strong visual memory that is not measured in standard intelligence tests. This was shown by Kleinfeld in a study of the visual memory of 125 Inuit village children in Alaska aged 9 to 16 compared with 501 white children in Anchorage and Fairbanks, the two principal towns in Alaska. The test consisted of the presentation of drawings for a brief period of time, after which the children were given the task of drawing them from memory. The Inuit children obtained a mean IQ of 106 in relation to the white mean of 100. Kleinfeld observes that this test result is consistent with the observations of travelers who have accompanied Inuit on long hunting expeditions. She writes that, quote, "Caucasians who have traveled with Inuit frequently remark on their extraordinary ability to travel through what seems to be a featureless terrain by closely observing the smallest landmarks and memorizing their spatial locations," close quote. Okay, this also helps to explain the male-female brain size difference. I'm not sure about other Native American tribes that aren't considered Arctic peoples who are further north but have really big brains, but I presume we would see a similar pattern. As we know, the subtests that males do a lot better than females on are visual spatial subtests. So this is a explanation that explains the wide variations in brain size, certain populations having really large brains, but IQs not as high as you would expect given their physically large brains. As for IQ, we know that IQ doesn't measure all of what is perceived to be intelligence. IQ is an excellent predictor of economic success within a Western country. And I believe it is a better predictor of economic success than education level. That is what IQ is good at doing. Now, I have a hypothesis that races with more agriculture in their evolutionary history will tend to have higher IQs, and we can infer the impact of agriculture on a population by their carbohydrate tolerance. Europeans, for example, despite eating more carbohydrates and more sodas and sports drinks, supposedly the worst kinds of carbohydrates, Europeans have a lower diabetes rate than blacks or Mexican Americans in the CDC sample. And the Hispanic population with the lowest diabetes rate are the Cubans, right? With the population with the most European admixture. American Indian and Alaskan natives have the highest diabetes rates. Now, maybe this has to do with their diet. Maybe they eat an extremely high carbohydrate diet, but I would assume that they don't. And the reason is that among blacks, Hispanics, and whites, it doesn't seem as though there's any economic barriers to purchasing meat for blacks, at least. And I believe the per capita income of Native Americans is about the same as that of blacks. I would assume that the high diabetes rate reflects a low carbohydrate tolerance among this population, which reflects a lack of agriculture in their evolutionary history, which results in these peoples, Alaska Natives and American Indians, having a lower IQ despite perhaps being more intelligent than Europeans in some other ways. Okay, so that's just my little hypothesis. It's not very well developed, but I think it has some pretty good explanatory power. Now, it's been a long time since I've read Rushton's Race, Evolution, and Behavior. I didn't fully agree with it when I first read it, and I don't recall enough to know if you're fairly characterizing it now. I would assume that you're not, given how much you're mischaracterizing what I'm saying.
For whatever reason, Fringe seems to have a problem with peer-reviewed literature. He says it's not all it's cracked up to be, but really never specifies why. He seems to be in favor of common knowledge, because we all know how well common knowledge has done historically when it comes to interpreting reality.
Wow. I can't believe I said that. No, really, I can't believe I said that. Let's take a look at what I actually said. The first tactic is to deny basic reasoning and basic critical thinking. And they do this by calling it common knowledge. You're just making an argument from common knowledge instead of using peer-reviewed science. Everyone's using peer-reviewed science. All of this is peer-reviewed. All these studies that I cite are all peer-reviewed. Okay, that's point one. Point two, peer review is not all it's cracked up to be. Okay, and I'm just going to leave it at that.
I don't know if Fringe still thinks that the sun revolves around the earth or not. I don't know. Someone would have to ask him.
I'm saying that egalitarians are blithely dismissing basic logic by just saying they're common sense arguments and therefore irrelevant. They're using the label common sense as a way to dismiss anyone pointing out the fundamental absurdity of their position. But Sophia made a fair point. I did not explain why I thought peer review was overrated. I just kind of asserted it. Well, here are a few reasons why I think this. One is academic mobbing. You know, you got a bunch of people who mob a target. Like we see this on YouTube all the time where a bunch of people start making a bunch of videos at the target, at one person at one time. You know, they target Brett Keane, or they target Amendem, or they target Ruka, or they target me, or they target, you know, they make a target out of someone. And this occurs in, you know, academia. Having a high IQ doesn't make you immune to this. And this stuff is well documented. Links in the description. It's not just me making this stuff up. Academic mobbing is real. Second point is that there's political bias and cause people not to publish things. That's not really an original criticism on my part. Also, it's inherently conservative because by definition, peer review is groupthink. You're getting a group of people to think on a hypothesis that you're putting forward, and you're having a group of people judging the merits of what you're saying. Charles Darwin's work on the origin of species by means of natural selection or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life, that did not pass peer review. That work went straight to public. Albert Einstein's Annus Mirabilis papers, they never passed peer review. They were published into they were put in a journal, but it was a public journal. It was like a magazine almost. It wasn't like an academic journal. Of course, without peer review, you also get Billy Bob's backyard theories of quantum mechanics, but that's fine. Evolution occurs through mutations, and most mutations fail, killing the organism with it. And peer review may result in fewer deleterious mutations getting through, but it can only slow the overall advance. You know, we can also look at the Alex Sokol scandal, where a physicist intentionally published a joke paper in some sociology journal and got it published just to see if he could, you know, say a bunch of rubbish and get it published, and he could. And now that was a sociology journal, to be fair, but it's evidence that the peer review process itself may be a little bit suspect. And there are a bunch of people with more science points than me who say that peer review is a very flawed system and doesn't catch any but the most obvious errors, with most of the errors in papers being found after the papers are published. And if there's a strong political zeitgeist and egalitarians control the journals, then egalitarians control what passes peer review and can say which worldviews have the most peer-reviewed papers to back up their position. It becomes a self-licking ice cream cone. And so peer review politicizes and democratizes science, which is only a bad thing.
Fringe makes this really strange claim that identifying genes is YouTube specific. I'm actually kind of glad he did that, because that allows me to bring up my own research on floral symmetry. In my research, there was a candidate transcription factor that we believe is responsible for floral symmetry. And so I actually ended up using RNAi in order to essentially temporarily silence the gene so that I could look at the floral phenotypes after. Now, this is a study that has implication for the evolution of flowering plants. Kind of like we're talking about the evolution of intelligence, perhaps. Maybe. So, I'm sorry, Fringe, that you don't think that biology has people asking about specific genes. You are welcome to leave the 19th century and join us in modern times if you ever feel that you can get past that. Otherwise, I guess you can stick to breeding peas.
Hey now, Mendel was a good man. By the way, did his work ever pass peer review? I don't think so. Anyway, notice that little switcheroo. Here's my argument. You don't need to find specific genes to infer narrow sense heritability. Nowhere else in biology is it required that specific genes be found to infer narrow sense heritability. Sophia's response. In biology, we try to find genes that cause the traits that we know beforehand by other means of inference to be narrow sense heritable. You see how this is a non-response. So my argument is that specific genes are not necessary to infer narrow sense heritability. You can do that if you have the wherewithal to do so. I'm simply saying it's not necessary. This was true in the 1800s, and it's true today.
He referenced a study I actually gave him.
The study, Is Homo sapiens Polytypic, written by Michael Woodley, is available for free online for anyone to see. I'll have it linked in the description.
Now, what's really interesting is this paper was published in the journal Medical Hypotheses. Medical Hypotheses at the time not being a peer-reviewed journal. Peter Duisberg, the king and, patron saint of HIV/AIDS denialism, was published in Medical Hypotheses, and his papers were later actually retracted in 2009. And so, just to give you an idea on where Fringe is getting his papers from.
Well, that was a nice backstory about a journal which published and later retracted 2 articles written by somebody else. Now, are these numbers incorrect? Is Michael Woodley incorrectly reporting heterozygosity estimates that others have found?
Anyway, you also like to talk about things like the regression of the mean.
Actually, it's regression to the mean, not of the mean.
During that discussion, I recall you having no idea what the hell a p-value was, and I actually had to explain to you what the null hypothesis versus the alternative hypothesis were mathematically for different statistical tests.
Well, I recall something different. As I recall, I said that the p-value was the probability that the observed result was a fluke and that there was no real correlation between the two things being studied, while in actuality the p-value represents the probability of the observed result occurring if the null hypothesis, usually meaning no relation between the two things being studied, is correct. And of course, because a null hypothesis wasn't relevant to what I thought a p-value meant, I had no conception of the null hypothesis. I noticed that while you point this out, you don't bother to explain how my misconception of a p-value actually crippled any of my arguments, as my misconceived p-value functioned in practice no differently than a properly conceived p-value. You just say,
in summary, I don't think you know what the fuck you're talking about, so you should probably stop before you look too stupid. I know you like to harp on and on and on about your, I guess you think it's a clever analogy, like the Rottweiler dolphin thing, that you think that somehow we could devise an intelligence test to measure both.
This is a lie. I offered a hypothetical species fair test as a thought experiment. You agreed to go along with the thought experiment. My point was not that such a test could actually be devised. You know what a hypothetical is, and you know how you're being dishonest right now. If it turned out that the dolphins scored higher on this hypothetical species fair test, my question was, would you have to find the specific genes responsible before concluding that the greater dolphin intelligence was congenital? Your answer was yes. Moving on.
I mean, I don't understand why people seem to think, and Fringe in particular seems to think, that all genetic markers are equal.
No.
As I was mentioning, the polytypic study that he referenced earlier, did you notice that in Homo sapiens, between Homo sapiens, they use single nucleotide polymorphisms, most of which are silent, therefore are neutral and are not undergoing selection? And then to measure the difference between Neanderthals and humans, they use mitochondrial DNA. Mitochondrial DNA probably alleles of whole genes. These are apples and oranges. You can't compare them.
Well, this is interesting because humans are generally considered to be a very young species and only left Africa about 100 to 120,000 years ago. So we would expect that the genetic differences between populations would be more a result of selection and less a result of genetic drift, simply because there hasn't been as much time for genetic drift as there has been in other species. For example, we can see large estimated FST differences between bonobos and different populations of common chimps. However, bonobos are estimated to have split off from common chimps about 1.56 million years ago. Thus, we can expect a greater proportion of the genetic distance between bonobos and other common chimps to be a result of genetic drift than is the distance between the races of humans. So when we compare this to human races whose genetic distance evolved over a much shorter period of time, we can surely say that the European Bantu difference is at least 47% as substantial as the common chimp, as the Central Common and bonobo difference, and almost certainly more significant since it came more from selection and less from genetic drift. Then Sophia Roon started talking about recombination and how you don't inherit all of your alleles from the same location and how it's possible to get all of your alleles from one side of the family. What this has to do with race and cognitive abilities being identical, I haven't the foggiest. I think Sophia Roon is just kind of getting off topic away from the issue at hand, cognitive differences between identifiable races. I know Sophia Roon doesn't deny the existence of semi-discrete population clusters, aka races, so I really have no idea what her point is supposed to be. She says I forgot recombination because it was somehow inconvenient for me, but doesn't explain how it's inconvenient. I'd be surprised if it was, since it's basic high school biology, and yet this is the first time I've ever heard an egalitarian say that recombination was inconvenient for racial hereditarians.
You have no idea how taxonomy works. You seem to think that the ranks for different species are like set in stone.
No. Pointing out that certain populations are considered a different species doesn't mean that I think these definitions are set in stone. In fact, there are a few people who say that chimpanzees are humans. I'm aware of the debates and fuzziness of categories, and how categories depend on your basis of categorization. I'm aware that all clusters are only semi-discrete, and that there's always a continuum, and this lecturing me on categories doesn't even seem to be related to what this is all about. Identifiable race in semi-discrete categories and cognitive function.
And there are organisms that if they come into contact, they can make viable offspring, but they don't. There are actually cicadas that are temporally isolated. One of them's on a cycle, I think it's every 17 years, and the other one's every 13. So even though they could come together and, on random factors of those two numbers I gave you, they're not considered the same species because they're temporally isolated. Isolation doesn't just mean geographic.
I never said it was, but when we're talking about human races, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about geographic separation and blockages of gene flow. Like, I don't know, does she think that I or the people watching her videos don't know these things? Depending on your definition of species, two organisms considered to be of different species can breed together. I mean, there's more than just cicadas, I know. So I don't know, I don't know what relevance this even has to anything that's being talked about here.
People don't understand these things. And you know what? This is why you, Fringe, are compared to a creationist. You don't understand how evolution works, and you use race as if in the same way that creationists use kind. It's not a taxonomic rank. There is no subspecies within Homo sapiens. And you're using it because you think that they look different, and that the way people look does not tell you what their genetic background is.
Self-identified race corresponds with genetic cluster, a cluster of predominant genetic ancestry at virtually 100%. I don't know what you're talking about. Does self-identified kind correspond at almost 100% with predominant genetic ancestry? And I know you're trying to say that there's no such thing as genetic ancestry, but every other geneticist I've read says there is. And no, it's not just me who gets compared to creationist by atheist cult. It's everyone who believes that the identifiable races differ in average cognitive function as a result of evolution. They've been debating creationists for so long that anyone who disagrees with them is compared to a creationist. That's all that's going on. It's inane.
And I always bring this up, but look at people in the South Pacific, like in Vanuatu, and compare them to sub-Saharan Africans. Phenotypically, they look very, very similar. But when it comes to their DNA, especially the short tandem repeat loci, they're very genetically distant.
Right. I've read through Louis Cavalli-Sforza's work. I've used it in many videos.
Okay, so you're using kinds because you'll say, oh, well, there are these main races, but then there are other, sub-races within there.
Oh, this is so mind-bendingly stupid. Okay, there are kingdoms, and then there are these phylums. That's just like kinds, derp. See, any attempt to categorize populations and subpopulations of humans, oh, that's like kinds. Well, then all population geneticists are fucking creationists then. Okay? Louis Cavalli-Sforza, creationist. Sophia Rune, you are stupid. Okay, now I'm not a geneticist, and certainly Sophia Rune could probably make some constructive criticisms of what I'm saying just because she's trained in genetics and I'm not. Right? She probably has some things that she could add, probably could find some errors that I'm making and correct them, but that's probably not going to happen because she's not interested in being constructive. She's ideologically motivated. I had a nagging fear that I was getting a ton of stuff wrong, but after Sophia Rune's response, I don't think I'm as far off the mark as I had feared. Okay, having listened to her objections, okay, I guess I'm not too clear on the differences between SNP and mitochondrial DNA differences. I may have to read up on that a little bit more. But aside from that, I'm more confident that I am, in general, correct now than I was before she made this response.